Ho, ho, ho. Homoousius. Nicholas the Nicholas the Sinner here. Today we're talking about the subject of the early church and specifically Jerome's doctrine of the church ministers, elders, and deacons. One of the things that the Reformation recovered is the early church's doctrine of the church offices. Now, over time, there was a pragmatic use of one of the presbyters as first among equals to be placed as the cathedras or the president of the presbytery, eventually just being called the bishop or overseer of the presbytery, which eventually became an office in itself in the medieval church, and slowly but surely became the entire order of prelacy in the Western church that we see today. In the Eastern church, it's a bit more simple. They have deacons and archdeacons. They have clergy, and then they have, which includes readers and cantors, and then you also see the priests, the presbyters, and the bishops and deacons there in the Eastern church. But these structures came up over time by necessity, and of course are practiced throughout the Eastern and Western Catholic churches and the Orthodox Church of the East, of course. But what we find in the New Testament is that the terms for deacon and elder are actually synonymous. So what you read in Jerome's letter to Evangelus is that he talks about this very thing. He says that when the apostles clearly teach that the presbyters are the same as bishops, and he goes on to show various places that this is the case. Now, he's writing this in order to tell people that deacons are not above the elders or above the presbyters in their rank, because apparently there was a practice that he talks about that they would look for a deacon to be a sponsor of somebody who was to be elected for presbyter. So basically, you had to have a good testimony. That eventually, this taught the deacons that they were over the presbyters in some way in a practice. And so Jerome is correcting that misunderstanding from the scriptures themselves. He talks about the Greek meaning of the word episkopuntes and how the overseeing duties of the bishops is what the elders are doing. So it's describing their function and also describing the name of their office as overseer. Epi means like upon in English, and then skopos, of course, refers to have the English word scope, to a place to see. So they have oversight. They are seeing over or ruling over the things that go on in the church. We also read about elders who rule well, and that they're commanded to rule well, and that's a virtue for elders, that they have the ability to rule well. Now, oversight, ruling well, those are not the exact same words, but it's a word concept fallacy to say that they are different things. Now, what we find in Jerome is that he points out, for example, in 1 John, that John himself calls, or sorry, 2 John, 3 John, he calls himself the presbyter. He says the presbyter unto the elect lady. He also talks about himself as the presbyter, writing to Gaius in 3 John. And then in 1 Peter chapter 5, Peter says, Peter, your fellow elder. He says, I am your fellow presbyter. So what we find is that the apostles themselves were actually declaring themselves to be elders. Now, they were not just elders, they were also apostles. They were of a different order and a different ordination, but they functioned like the elders, and if they functioned alongside the elders in the council of Acts chapter 15, over which James was the presiding elder. And you can find in the early church, in the early writings of the church fathers, of the second century, you'll find that Irenaeus and others refer to themselves as the cathedras. That is the one who is the president, the one seated as the presiding officer of the regional church, the presbytery, we would call it. And of course, you call it a diocese. So these are things that you have to look into and see that Jerome actually explains where this came from. He says, for what function, excepting ordination, belongs to a bishop that does not also belong to a presbyter? It is not the case that there is one church at Rome and another in all the world, Gaul and Britain, all these different places. He talks about all these different things about the distinction that should not be made. But in one place he points out, and let's see if I can find it here. He says, here's the circumstances that came up. When subsequently one presbyter was chosen to preside over the rest, This was done to remedy schism and to prevent each individual from rending the church of Christ by drawing it to himself. So, in other words, it was done pragmatically at the time in order to stop schism. So that's a pretty helpful thing to understand that Jerome himself had seen these things happen. He knows why it came to pass. It was a pragmatic thing. He explains this is where this misunderstanding comes from as well, to distinguish the presbyters from the bishops and make them into different offices. And he's saying that that's not the case, that presbyters and bishops all have equality, and you have one presiding over the presbytery or over the regional church, but that he is not a different office. He is a first among equals in how he functions, but he himself is still a presbyter and an episcopuntes. And so he points out that for even at Alexandria, from the time of Mark the Evangelist until the episcopates of Heraclius and Dionysius, the presbyters always named as bishop one of their own number, chosen by themselves and set in a more exalted position, just as an army elects a general, or as deacons appoint one of themselves, whom they know to be a diligent man, and they call him archdeacon. So in other words, he's functioning as a president of a group, he's leading the group, but he himself is one of the group. And so this is helpful for us to understand that there is a parity among the elders and the bishops, and that the bishops and elders are not ranks, but rather one is a functional rank that is given to the church. Church pastors really function like this. They're pastors who labor in preaching and teaching, and that they are able to execute the office of those who are stewards of the mysteries of God as ministers of Jesus Christ. But they are all equal as elders in a regional church. This is something to think about. If there are people from the East who have been watching this, or people from Roman Catholicism, you can inform me of things that I've missed. But it's important to read these original documents, the primary documents of the early church, because what we find is that the early church was very much Presbyterian in its practice. We have moderators of our presbyteries that function as leaders for us. We have moderators of our denominations that function as leaders for us, and they become like a general that we've appointed as one among us to be the one who speaks about different subjects. So it's important for us to recognize these things, that we could remedy a lot by reforming the church to this original pattern, because the original problem was that people were taking away glory of the church and schismatically removing it to themselves. Now that has happened in all sorts of ways, but through the prelacy. And so my recommendation is Reformation. So to all of you, I bid you farewell, Merry Christmas, and to all a good night. Ho, ho, ho! Homoousius! Thank you for watching Blue Collar Reformation. We are here to equip you with wisdom of the Word. The aim is to apply the system of doctrine taught in Scripture to every square inch of faith and life. We are on Twitter and Substack for your sake. Links are in the description. Share with your recalcitrant and reprobate friends and family freely. Blue Collar Reformation is a lightweight and mobile outreach platform. Take it in hand and enter the fray. Godspeed.